What's up everyone on the internet? Thank you for making this video party. I'm so excited to upload this one for you guys because for this talk around the block, honestly, I just feel like talking about podcasts. Old podcasts, current podcasts, and even new podcasts that I'm getting into right now. Because for me, I remember I got into podcasts back when I was in my middle of my senior year of high school, and that was when I was trained to be a shot put thrower for my high school's track team. And I remember I would take these long drives. I remember my dad actually, he drove me over to, he drove me over to Long Beach, where basically there was this guy there who basically knew how to train shot put throwers. But it was the drives that I remember the most, because during those drives, my dad would put on the Adam Carolla podcast, and that was when I first was introduced to podcasts, and I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool, this is pretty funny. And then he mentions the Adam and Drew podcast, or Adam and Dr. Drew podcast. And then honestly, I remember there were some moments in that podcast that were pretty funny, and I was like, okay, I can get into this. It was almost like radio. And I really liked how it was basically set up, because all you needed was a mic and just to go and just start talking about whatever was on your mind. And that's when I was really interested in the idea of podcast. And I think for me, I only listened to the Adam and Dr. Drew podcast for about maybe a year or so. And then that was when honestly I discovered a new podcast that I liked, and it's basically by the people I really love following most, because I think these people make great new content every day or so, and it's actually called the Rooster podcast. And for me, it was oh my god, this is mind-blowing. I mean, I love how they each have 4 new people on their podcast or every now and then, and it's an every week kind of thing. And I really love how there's you have one of the co-founders of the company there, you have a British person, you have 2 other people there, and they all just talk about whatever's on their mind. And I say it's really funny to see how someone I think someone from England has their own perspective of how things are done, and I think it's pretty funny. For me, it's I really like that podcast, and I've listened to that podcast I think since 2013, and I'm still current with it right now. So I think it's 7 years. So that's 7 years of listening to that podcast, and it still never gets old. And they have some of their funniest episodes that I save, and I usually re-listen to it whenever I'm doing work or anything or studying for school. And I still crack up at the same jokes that they made that were probably 4 or 5 years ago. And then later on down the line, I actually got into kind of movie podcast, more specifically the AMC Movie Talk, Collider Movie Talk, and then the John Campea Show. And those sort of podcasts I really like listening to, because they really give me a lot more information about movies and stuff. I love hearing all the latest movie news and which actors signing on to be in the next movie. I use this for example. I remember just I think yesterday I was listening to the John Campea Show, and I remember how they were talking about how one of the writers and the directors for The New Gods is still writing the draft for the movie, and The New Gods is basically DC's version of Thanos, where you learn about Darkseid and a lot of people the gods and whatever on 2 different planets, whatever. And so basically it's just it's being made by the person who made Selma and A Wrinkle in Time. And the movie was announced I think maybe a year ago or something, and we still haven't heard anything from it. So to hear to listen to this podcast, to hear more news about it, it kind of reinforces me how okay, this movie, I can't wait to see this movie. And there are also times where mention how the situation between Universal and the movie theaters. And when I listened to that podcast, I was able to learn that what Universal did with Trolls, and by screwing over the movie theater chains, it really tore a big gap between the two. Because when you think about movie theaters and the actual studios, they actually rely on each other. I mean, the theaters rely on the movies for them to make money, and the studios rely on the theaters or to help them make money. And so to have Universal just screw over the movie theaters by releasing Trolls online, while they originally had the idea, or they had the plan of releasing it in theater, it's kind of heartbreaking. So I can see why theaters like Regal and AMC would kind of would retaliate by saying okay, you want to release your movies online, fine, but guess what, we're not going to show any of more Universal movies ever. And so I usually get a lot of these sort of news whenever I listen to the John Campea podcast or Collider. I used to listen to AMC, but then they converted over to Collider, So I think for me, mostly the movie stuff I listen to actually comes from the John Campea podcast. So while I have a more general podcast and a more movie podcast, there actually is one new podcast that I'm actually listening to right now, and it's pretty funny. And the funny thing is that it's also made by several of my family relatives. I mean, I got like basically 4 of my cousins and my uncle in there. And the funny thing is that this podcast first started right when this whole quarantine thing was being enforced. And so the podcast is called The Gathering, and what it's basically about is that it's just my family relatives just talking over, I think, Zoom or something. I forgot the app they use, but it's just them like talking like through their mics and their phones and stuff, and they're just talking about whatever like nerd stuff that comes to mind. And the funny thing is that they also like mentioned how like there's a lot of key topics they go through. Like I remember one topic they talked about was like, if you can meet any 80s icon, dead or alive, who would it be? And there was also one like saying like, I can't remember what it was, like, oh yeah, if you can have any pet animal, what would it be? Another cool thing about them is that they take suggestions like from their fans. And I remember telling my uncle, saying like, yeah, give yourself a superpower, then give each of my cousins a superpower, and then we'll see where that goes. And so honestly, man, it turned mean. I mean, I expected them to be like play nice with superpowers, but man, they were giving each other some crappy ones, and I thought it was just so freaking hilarious. And I think I just listened to their podcast yesterday, the new one, and they come out I think it comes out every Saturday. So subscribe to them and you will get a new podcast every Saturday. And so honestly, the material they're coming out with, and they're just starting off, and for a podcast just starting off right now and already making you laugh within I think they're in 5 episodes. I don't know, honestly, I gotta check again, but they're pretty recent. Like, they started this whole podcast right when the quarantine thing was happening, which is unfortunate. But I also think it's kind of good because that like they're able to pull this off. Like this I think this app I can't remember the name of, but they're able to pull this off, and they can still like communicate with each other and just have a few laughs. And I remember one of them telling me that like, yeah, eventually when this whole quarantine thing is over, and I hope that's soon, but when this whole thing is over, they're gonna actually start doing I think like more actual podcasts, like, you know, meeting up and having microphones set up. And they tell me, hey, if you want to come, yeah, we would really want you to have come with us on an actual live podcast. And I said, absolutely. I mean, when and where? Because once this quarantine's done, I'm going to go do it. So keep an eye out, because I actually may make an appearance on that podcast. And also the funny thing is that they also they do mention me from time to time, which I think is pretty cool of them. They mentioned this video, and I think it's also pretty cool how we're both supporting each other, because we're both starting off. Like, I started this YouTube channel a while ago, and so it's nice to hear like other people actually like give praise to this channel, and so I'm returning the favor to them. It's like, okay, you guys did some good stuff for me, I'm gonna do some good stuff for you, which is why I'm talking about their podcast right now. And I think it's pretty cool how they are just starting off, and I can totally see like this podcast just taking off in the near future. And I think like with more and more people subscribing to them, they're gonna get more creative, they're gonna get more funny, and honestly, just subscribe to them right now, because it's pretty fun to listen to. And the way you can find their podcast is that I think it's on anchor.com. I can't remember the name of it, but I do know that they just now started working with iTunes or the Apple podcast store or whatever. So if you have like an Apple, whatever, I think you can find it on the podcast app, which is what I do. And I love it because I always get notifications from them every time they post up a new podcast every week. Well, that's going to do it for this video, guys. That was my overall talk about podcasts. I'll be sure to put a link down for the Gathering podcast so you can subscribe to them. If you like what you saw, click on the subscribe button so you can always updates from this channel. Stay safe, stay healthy. I will see you all next time with a brand new video. Bye-bye.